Hi, welcome to episode 11. Let's talk about clefs, baby. Let's talk about F and C. Let's talk about all the good clefs and the bad clefs there may be. There, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about clefs, baby. So, let's first go back to our favorite song, Mary Had a Little Lamb. You remember we found out the notes way back in one of the episodes on rhythm and duration. We found out that it was mostly quarter notes, and it was like Mary had a little lamb. Let's just do that much. Mary had a little lamb. And it was in a 4/4 time signature. And we just never quite got to the pitches. So let's talk about how people used to notate pitches just really quick. Quick history. So people used to not even have a staff like we have now, right? Our staff is those lines, sheet music is written on. But people used to just draw little squiggly things for notes. And maybe for Mary Had a Little Lamb, like over the text or under the text, they'd write something like, Mary had a little lamb. And then someone got the great idea of making the little squiggles go up and down to show the notes. So like this. This is a terrible example of it. This isn't what they really looked like. But these were called raised neumes. And these guys here are just called neumes. Basically, it's a lot like what we've been doing, where we draw the little dashes to indicate every note. A neume was just a special kind of shape. Again, I'm not really reproducing it, nor could I without a quill pen. The shape of these things is like you need the broad tip, a nib of a quill pen. Anyhow, raised neumes are good for a simple melody with a low range and that doesn't get too far and that you kind of know in your head. And that's what scholars think raised neumes were. They were more of like a reminder. If there was a song you knew, like if you were a monk, you had to have a lot of hymns memorized. And so the first instance of what we call raised neumes are usually seem kind of like a cheat sheet that monks kind of penciled in over top, or penned in, I should say, over top of the words in their hymnals and stuff. But then finally someone got the idea of drawing a line. And it was never standard for so long how many lines you had. But right when people started using a line to help us understand pitches, is when we first started getting this thing of how pitch notation works. So they would draw a line, and then once you have a line, you can have a note on top of the line, on the line, or below the line. And so here I have notes of Mary Had a Little Lamb shown only using one line. Mary had a little lamb. So see, like, me, little lamb, me, little, and lamb are all the note above the line. Re and are on the line. And had, Mary had, is below the line. So with just one line, you can show three different pitches pretty well. But then say we got to the next phrase and we were like, little lamb. It's really hard to tell how far away this note is. How do we know it's not little lamb? That would be wrong, right? Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. I don't know. You can't tell. So some ancient person was like, what if we use two lines? And then you could be like, Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. And now we know what that last little lamb interval is. We skip the note that's on the line, right? And this way of notation just continued to develop. There's, at different times in history, been any number of lines. There was a long time where it wasn't even set in stone how many lines you use. Different people would use different amounts. There were staffs that had up to, I don't remember, I think like 7 lines. And try and imagine that. Try and imagine how confusing that would be on your eye to try and read music written on a 7-line staff, right? Especially notes like in the middle, you can't just at a glance tell where you are. So eventually they kind of settled on a number of lines. And I know you think where I'm going, you think I'm going to say 5 lines probably. But no, they settled on 4 lines. And for a really long time, music always had 4 lines. And to this day, in more like traditional Catholic churches, or I forget what that's called, like Orthodox churches or whatever, they read hymnals, the Liber Usualis it's called. And in that book, all the hymns and all the psalms and all the stuff is written on 4-line staffs. How do you know what note is what? And that's why we're going to talk about clefs, baby. The lines mean nothing, just like when we're talking about solfege, or just like when we're talking about rhythmic durations. They're all this system of interrelationships, this proportional system that is not explicitly linked to an actual pitch, an actual letter name pitch, until you provide a way to unlock what pitch is what. So let's say we wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb, and let's say we wrote it in the key of C. Oh wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's say we just wrote it like this. Mary had a little lamb. And we were using neumes. Pretend these are pretty, like those boxy neumes, like you saw when I was talking about ut queant laxis. And we wanted to know what notes these exactly were. Well, what we need is a key, like a key that tells us, just like in a map has a key that tells you what the symbols are on it. We have the same thing in music. And in fact, the word clef, like the word clave, means key. Clef comes from a word that means key. And a clef is a symbol we put at the beginning of a staff to tell us where a certain note is. And then from knowing where that note is, we can tell where the rest of the notes are. So if we wanted to sing this in the key of C, then this note, Mary had should be a C. And in ancient times, they would just literally write a C. It was kind of a somewhat stylized little C. They'd write it right there if they wanted C to be right there. But you could move this C clef onto any line. You don't really find it on a space because it doesn't look good on a space. In fact, none of our clefs tell you what a space is. They always tell you what a line is. And then from them, you can just figure out what all the other lines are, right? Or spaces. So C is here, D is in this space, E is on this line, F is in this space, G is on this line, A is in this space, B is on this line, C is sitting on top of the staff, B is sitting below the staff, right? All you need is just one line to figure out what all the rest of the notes are. And that's why they call it a key. It's like the key that opens up the knowledge of what all the notes on the staff are. In ancient times, they would use this C clef, and then there was one other clef they used very commonly, and it was an F clef. And so we could write this same kind of music, but if we used an F clef, let's say we did an F clef here. This is my best imitation of what this ancient F clef looked like. I'm not using a quill pen, and even if I was, let's be honest, it wouldn't really look right. But this was the stylized F, something like that. Kind of looks like an F, not really. But what that tells you is that this line is F. So if we were going to write Mary Had a Little Lamb using this ancient clef, it would look like this. We'd start on an E, one below F in this space, E, D, C, D, E, 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 right? So that's the origins of clefs. And these were the earliest 2 clefs, like I said, an F clef and a C clef. And they're still with us today. The C clef has changed shapes a lot, and the F clef has changed shapes a lot. Let's start with the F clef. The F clef is one of our most common clefs we still use today. If you've ever learned piano or anything like that, or learned to read music in any way, then you probably have seen a bass clef. Mine looks like this. Most people's kind of squiggle around more. And they have these two dots. If you look at that, that looks a lot like an F, right? You could even almost imagine kind of like a normal F written in there. And most of the clefs have some way of like indicating like which line they go with. The F clef, it's with its two dots. There used to be a time when this clef was movable. Technically, it still is. You could write an F clef like this. It would confuse the hell out of people in today's world. In today's world, our F clef pretty much just stays here, where the second line from the top is F. Oh, also, in today's world, we use 5 staffs. Almost everyone does. At some point, that kind of settled down. I'm not exactly sure when, but I want to say 1400s, 1500s. Sometime around then, we settled on 5 lines. I think 5 lines is like a good compromise where you don't get lost. Like if you see a note in the middle somewhere, it's not super confusing to figure out how many lines in you are. But it's not so few lines that you run out of room to write notes. Anyhow, so this F clef is what we call the bass clef. And as you probably know, like I said, if you've studied music before, especially if you studied piano, you're probably used to thinking of the F clef as your left-hand clef. And then in piano music, there's usually 2 clefs, and the other one is this G clef. You can totally see the G in the G clef. You can like almost literally see it in there. It's like this cursive G, and it has a squiggle, and the squiggle squiggles around the second line. So the F clef is telling you that this is F, and then the G clef is telling you that this is G. And if we were to theoretically connect these staffs all the way together, we would go from this A through this B, and then there'd be a C here, and then we'd get to this D and this E. Now, I'm going to cross this out as soon as I write it. You never want to actually write a note in the middle like this. Please don't. But that's where this C is, and this C is the C we call middle C. Is it the middle C because it's in the middle of these staffs? Or is it the middle C because it's the middleest C on a piano? I'm not sure. Let's talk about some other clefs. So that's our bass and treble clef. It's an F clef and a G clef. They don't move anymore. We also have a C clef still. For some reason, our C clef looks like this now, which you tell me how the hell that is supposed to be a C. I have no idea. But in kind of the armpit of the C, or the butt crack of the C clef, that means middle C. So no matter where you put this clef, in the very middle of it is middle C. And this clef you might not think is important, but violists still read this C clef exclusively. No other instrument reads it, at least often. And then the other most important C clef. Now C clefs can move around, you see. So here's a clef we call a tenor clef. And in a tenor clef, middle C is right here. So that gives you more room on the staff below, right, than this clef, which is also called an alto clef. And as you might be able to guess, if we were in box time and you were writing for a choir, the altos would use this clef, the tenors would use this clef, the basses would use this clef, and then the sopranos would use their own version of the C clef, which is right here. Everybody got their own clef. I'm not going to confuse you. There's a lot more much rarer clefs, but the treble clef or G clef, the bass clef or F clef, both of which don't move, and then the tenor clef and the alto clef. The tenor clef gets used sometimes by cellos and by trombones when they get really high. I mean, when they play really high, not when they get really high. Oh well, I'm out of time. This has been your introduction to clefs. We talked about clefs, baby. Goodbye.